Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this week's midweek video where I take viewers' images and I try to resolve some of the problems that they might be having with their post-processing with those photographs. Now then, so far I've just put a call out on my members page, but what I'm going to do is put a call out to my general viewers, that's you guys. If you would like to submit an image for possible inclusion in one of these weekly videos, please contact me through my website, and I will tell you all the details of how you can submit a photograph. So basically what I'm looking for is a RAW file, a JPEG of the finished image that you have processed, and a very short description of what the problem is that you're having with that photograph. And then what I do is make a video and try to resolve that. Now I try to do it mostly in Lightroom because I know most of you use Lightroom. I might end up using a bit of Photoshop in the future, we'll see how it goes, but primarily Lightroom. So if you're interested in submitting images, go to my website and shoot me an email and we'll see what we can do. All right, let's get stuck right into this week's image. Okay, this is the photograph that we're looking at today, and this is a photograph taken by Barb Livieri. Barb's question was this. The light rays were everywhere. This is in Oregon, but I couldn't seem to capture them properly without blowing out the highlights. So I exposed for the highlights, then the image was super dark, and all you could see were a few bright blobs. So then I bracketed one for the highlights and one normal, but when I merged them in HDR, and you can merge images in Lightroom, the tree trunks where the brightest streams of light are hitting, they look like they're melted. Looks terrible. Okay, so as Barb has mentioned, one of the biggest issues with scenes like this is that it's very difficult to expose for the highlights and the shadows and get good detail throughout the image. You either have to give up one or the other. So, if you expose for the highlights, which are very bright in this image, then you're going to end up losing the shadows, as in this example here. Barb is exposed for the highlights, she's lost the beams of light, and she's lost the shadows, but the highlights are still within reason. And then on the other extreme, if you expose for the foreground here, the shadows, then you start to lose details in the highlights. And what Barb ended up doing was combining the underexposed image and the overexposed image and then adjusting them in Lightroom. And she's getting some strange ghosting in the trees here. Now then, there's a number of different ways we can deal with this. We can either just play around with this exposure here, because if we look in the shadows here, they're nice and clean. There's no noise in there whatsoever, which is great. The beams of light, all we have to do is just tone them down a little bit. They don't have to have detail in them because bright areas like this won't have detail in them anyway, but we can bring them back somewhat. With this example here, we can also do the same, but the problem is when we bring up the shadows, so if we bring the exposure right up, you can see that all of a sudden we can see the beams of light again. But what happens is if we zoom in on the shadows here, we start to introduce a lot of noise, which is not great. The advantage to combining these two is that it'll take the best of both of them, hopefully, and you should be able to get detail in the highlights and the shadows. So let's go ahead and try that. We'll do exactly what Barb did and see if we can improve on that. Try and get rid of some of that ghosting. So I've selected both images, right click on them, and then just go to photo merge HDR. And Photoshop does a pretty good job of merging those images. Now you have to remember they have to be taken one after the other so they align. Now you'll notice here it says deghost amount. I'm going to go high on this one, and I suspect that Barb perhaps went a little bit lower on this. So let's go as high as we can so that the transition is a little bit more subdued. So let's go with that. And it should come up with another version of those photographs. So here it is here. So that's the combined version from those two. So if we zoom in on the shadows, they look quite clean. And then if we start to look into the highlights, it's not too bad. So I suspect when Barb did this, that perhaps it was just a lower setting on the on that merging. I'm not sure with the ghosting there. So, but you can, as you can see, the beams of light are not spectacular, and the shadows are still a little bit dark, but we have a lot of wiggle room in here now. So what we can do is, if we shift Option on a Mac, just bring the blacks up a little bit, and the highlights. Let's have a look at the highlights here. So the highlights all in here. We can adjust those with some filters. So we'll adjust that in a minute. The whites, let's have a look at those, same area. Okay, and the exposure, let's bring the exposure up just a little bit. And we're going to warm this up a little bit as well. It's looking a bit green and a bit blue. Actually, maybe we'll add a little bit of red in there as well. So one of the problems with images like this is as soon as you start to bring back the highlights and open up the shadows, then they start to look really quite flat. So we need to add that contrast and keep that contrast going so that we still have that depth. The beams of light here, they're okay, but they're looking a little bit lost. So I'm going to go extreme with these and grab a radial filter. So the radial gradient. And I'm going to pick this area right here. And I'm going to go with a dehaze here. And just bring that up. Not too much because it starts to look fake. Something like that might look good. Now you can see that the highlights are blown out a little bit, but it's not really that concerning to my eye. Remember, these are bright highlights, so you're not going to have detail in there anyway, as long as they're not blown out to the point where it's like that. So we can bring the exposure up just a little bit, and this is all obviously to taste. But now what we can do is bring the highlights down a little bit, just ever so slightly, and we can play around with the whites. So you'll notice now that the highlights are not blown out, and if we zoom in to 200%, we don't really have any ghosting in there. Now, if you think that perhaps this has got too much dehaze in it, obviously you can dial that back a little bit. Or what you can do, if you really like the dehaze in the highlights, but not so much on the shadowed side of the trees, we can have a bit of a luminance range mask in there. So I just clicked on the minus section here of that radial mask gradient, and just click on luminance range. And what I can do, let's just zoom in here so we can see what's happening. I can, here's the luminance mask here. I could dial back the highlights here ever so slightly, and you'll see that it's only affecting the highlight areas. The problem with this, especially with this contrast range, is that if you do too much, it starts to look very odd. There's some strange things that start to happen. So you have to be careful when you're using this method. See, I quite like it if I dial back the highlights all the way back to here. So basically, that mask that we put on is just affecting those beams of light and not the trunks of the trees. And if I show you the mask here, you can see that it's masked out all of the shadowed areas except for the highlights. So now if we zoom back out again, you can see that the light beams are quite prominent, but we don't have any strange ghosting on the trees here. What we do have, though, is that we do have a little bit of noise introduced into those areas. So if you look at this area here, this has taken more of the exposure of the overexposed image that we started out with. This one here, you can see here, and then the underexposed, you can see that that noise has been introduced to this section here, if that all makes sense to you. So here's our final kind of image here. You can see that there's quite a bit of noise in there. Now, another way that we could deal with this image is by just taking the exposure where the highlights are overexposed, because Barb has exposed for the foreground here. And the reason why I'd go with this exposure is because the underexposed one, as soon as we bring up those shadows, there's just too much noise in there. And part of the problem with that has to do with the sensor size. And I've said this a number of times in my previous videos. One of the reasons why I use a larger format camera is that there's a huge amount of dynamic range in there. So it's not just because, I can blow up the image massively. It's also because I can really pull out those shadows without affecting them too much. As an example, here's an image that I took in the redwoods this past summer, and I've exposed for the highlights, so the highlights are well exposed, but the shadows are obviously in deep shadow. But if I bring up the exposure, let's go to the develop here, bring up the exposure, then I can bring up those highlights. Now I'm still going to get noise, but not as drastic as, say, Barb's rendition with her camera. And that's just because the sensor is just a little bit smaller. The smaller the sensor, the harder it is to capture that huge amount of dynamic range. But you can see that we have a well exposed image. Bring the highlights down and the whites a little bit, and I can bring the shadows up, and I almost have a perfectly exposed image with just one shot. Now remember, this is at 200%. Let's go to 100%. There is still noise in there, no doubt about it, but not as much as, say, a smaller sensor. Let's see here. Oops, that's the wrong one. This one here starts to get quite crunchy. But if we take the exposure where Barb has exposed for the shadows, we can definitely play around with this. So what we can do here is, let's just warm up the image a little bit. We're going to bring the shadows up ever so slightly and the exposure. But what I'm going to do now is actually take a radio filter. Whoops. In here again, dehaze. I'll dehaze it ever so slightly, and we can bring the whites down and the highlights, and you can see we more or less get the same effect as the one we fiddled with before. And actually this one's quite a bit brighter, and to be honest with you, I like the cooler tones in this rather than the warmer tones. But if we zoom in, Let's go to 100% or even 200% in here. You can see that there's hardly any noise in here whatsoever. So I wouldn't fuss too much with these high dynamic range photographs. Now, obviously, if you have, say you're trying to photograph a sunset or a sunrise and you have beautiful color in the sky and you want to include a foreground, then yes, combining images is probably a good idea. But in this case, I think you could get away without having to combine images. You'd probably be better off just to take this one exposure and work with that, because we all come to expect these bright highlights to be somewhat overexposed anyway. The only tricky part is when you're actually printing this, you want to have some kind of texture or a little bit of detail in there so that you're not getting paper white in all of the white areas. Perhaps just a few little specular highlights, but just dial back the whites or the highlights as we've done here. Well, thank you ever so much for watching this week's video. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a comment and a thumbs up. That's always appreciated. And lastly, if you'd like to support my channel in other ways, I have quite a few Antarctica books left. My calendars will be going on sale because I have quite a few still left. And of course, New Year's is coming rapidly. So if you'd like a calendar, be sure to head on over to my website. I also have a number of Quiet Light books left through Kozu Books, who happen to have a 25% off sale right now, where you can buy 2 books for 25% off, which is a good deal. And what else do I have? Oh, hats and prints and the usual stuff. So go check that stuff out. All right, folks, thank you ever so much. And hopefully I'll have a video out this coming Sunday. All right, till then, bye-bye.